of the special interview series for the Middle East and Africa Forum for Sustainability Leaders, a series of talks with those responsible of steering organizations in their sustainability journeys and helping them advancing towards their commitments. I'm pleased to have today's guest speaker, Dakshita Rajkumar, Chief Sustainability Officer for the Middle East, Africa, and Asia at ENGIE. Welcome, Dakshita, and I'd like to kick off this interview by asking you about your role as a CSO in the region. I'd like to ask, how was it initially identified the need at ENGIE, one of the largest utility companies in the world, to have a chief sustainability officer specifically for the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, a massive geographical region, and how was that position institutionalized?
So firstly, thank you so much. I think the debate is really hot in the year of sustainability. And as we lead up to COP28, I think it is really an opportunity for sustainability professionals to gain momentum on a lot of the agendas that we are talking about today. So to answer your question, I think, most of the roles when it comes to sustainability is probably already embedded into an organization. With ENGIE specifically, and with regards to our geographical portfolio, ENGIE is a multinational organization with a global footprint. And with that being said, it was very important in terms of our ENGIE strategy that we have that local chapter presence. We have that local adaptation, especially to drive and support our stakeholder needs as we operate in the countries that we do. And most important, ENGIE strategy was always one of a decentralized approach, which meant, again, working closer with our stakeholders in the countries that we operate, and again, supporting, be it those country requirements when it comes to legislation or their own sustainability requirements. And what was additional that I think was a business driver to leverage having different roles in the different countries when it came to sustainability was around EU taxonomy. As we are a French organization, we are bound by the EU taxonomy, EU directives that requires us to kind of ensure our compliance in any of the global geographic portfolios that we operate in. And so kind of managing that at one central point always becomes quite a tedious task and never tends to work out efficiently. So having roles in the various or strategic countries that we operate, I think contributes to the local discussions, contributes to meeting our stakeholder engagements, that also drives that upward stream of information for us to comply with European directives.
I wanted to follow up on that point on the differences between of the role of a chief sustainability officer from one region to another. As you mentioned, in the EU, Europe, you're bounded by the EU directives. What's the difference of the role in the case of this region compared to other geographies?
Look, I've always maintained the knowledge that in every organization, there is no distinctions. Maybe the level of context and prioritization may be different for different stakeholders or sustainability professionals based on sector, based on local adaptations or the countries that you do operate. But I've always maintained that I think everybody in an organization is a sustainability professional or ambassador in their own right. So whether that is someone in operational department that is driving efficiency in how a function actually operates, or whether that is someone in finance that is driving down those financial cost savings and gaining those return of investments, or whether it's someone in procurement, for example, that is driving that supplier kind of governance and strengthening those portfolios when it comes to supply chain. So we all kind of hold that kind of hat of sustainability in some way or the other. It doesn't really differ from different organizations operating in different parts of the world. It's how you apply it and in what context and in what sector that gains the level of prioritization. Yes, the urgency in Europe is around EU directives and EU taxonomy, but that doesn't negate the fact that in a country, be it GCC or in South Africa or in Australia, that legislations are also not the driving force as well. So ultimately, there's no distinction. in terms of where you manage sustainability.
I'd like to go back to that point where you mentioned that, essentially sustainability is not one person's job. So it requires the entire organization to be rowing forward. How do you spread that sort of message to ensure the engagement required from all the different parts of the organization, the different teams to be involved in that push forward?
I always like to maintain that sustainability professionals, you call them a well-versed or well-rounded kind of function. Why? They need to understand the business fully, to better drive that internal efficiency, to better manage stakeholder needs, both internal and external. And ultimately, with any governance structure, it comes down with having that top leadership commitment. This makes our job much easier. Ultimately, we're driving one kind of or steering one kind of ship when it comes to a organizational strategy, being embedded into a business model. It makes our role and responsibility much easier, which means that you would definitely need to have that top management commitment. You would then ultimately integrate and have that collaboration between various functions, helping them on the journey of driving efficiency or applying those sustainability practices. And as I mentioned, I gave you an example, is that whether it is procurement, for example, and if they are managing a portfolio of suppliers, how are they managing it? Are they looking at supplier CSR aspects? Are they looking at how are we sourcing responsibly? Or whether we look at an HR function. Yes, HR can look at the social indicators when it comes to diversity and inclusion, talent management and retaining that. So it's working in collaboration with different functions and helping those functions have a different perspective when it comes to best practices, benchmarks, and stakeholder needs.
Yeah, and for those organizations that are in the initial steps of creating from scratch a sustainability department or institutionalizing a chief sustainability officer, what would be your advice for those initial steps on how to build up from the ground those kind of capabilities?
Like I mentioned a little earlier on in the conversation, is that I'm sure there are probably all of the individuals in an organization that are probably doing some element of sustainability. My first, I think, suggestion would be is try to map out what is the organization's, strategy and long-term vision, and what needs to be documented and what needs to be reported. And once you start to understand that, you will start to understand who's reporting what, where are they reporting it, and how can you access it. I think that is always a great starting point to kind of get to a status quo of where you are in a business. When it comes, and once you understand that status quo, you basically understand that, do we have a vision as an organization or no? How can I then build on this data that I do have in terms of current status and presence, and then build on and supporting the vision of be it board of shareholders or executive committees in an organization, is to help build that strategy. So if you know your status quo on carbon footprint is so many million tons or so many kilotons, what do we want to get to? So building that kind of framework and then taking it up to the next level of leadership, I think this is vital. With embedding that strategy into place. Upon which, when you do have that leadership commitment and buy-in and on your long-term strategy, I think the next part of it is that how do we then drive those wheels within each of those functions? How do we build short-term goals to achieve that long-term strategy? And I think that is key, is we all love to have that long-term vision, but we don't know where's the starting point. And I go back to saying your starting point is always first understanding where you want to be, your status quo, and then building a company strategy that is bought in by your executive structures in an organization, and then building those short-term goals.
Yeah, and in terms of skill sets, you mentioned, for instance, the need of creating of reporting on various sustainability aspects, such as the carbon footprint. To what extent is it necessary to, upskill different departments on sustainability related skills. What is your view on that? What would you think would be the main skill sets that are needed across the organization to make sure that, for instance, that sustainability reporting effort is well takes place in a holistic way?
I always say awareness, capacity building should be the foundational element of anything you do. We don't necessarily take it for granted that everybody is aware and know how to report or share and implement effectively. And so as you build that status quo and of understanding of where your data lies, who's doing what, and mapping those roles and responsibilities, that will clearly already build that structure of who is doing what and what level of capabilities is currently in play. And so based on that, it'll help you, for example, if we are working with operations and we expect carbon data, how do we expect that carbon data? Are they providing it in the right methodology or the right systems to provide that data? Do we need to build that initial capacity, train them to understand simple things like what's scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, so that it also translates to the person that's providing you information more meaningful business sense. Now he or she is able to kind of, embed his reporting or her reporting requirements into a bigger umbrella, which is driving an organizational strategy. And I think that is strategically important, is number one is building that information, building that capacity, building that knowledge and awareness, because you could be also not a key role or individual that's supporting a sustainability kind of database of information, but you could be on the sideline that is also driving the engines of an organizational strategy. Is how do you also onboard them in terms of as one machine to create that clarity and work towards that one company strategy. And I think at NG, I have to say that we have an approach of a one NG culture. And whether it is working with someone who is an administrator in the business, how is your role and responsibility adding to the global sustainability strategy of NG? It is important. So there's always degrees of knowledge, information, sharing, awareness that needs to be developed as you implement your sustainability strategy.
And in that matter, in order to know what's happening, in the respective, in all the different departments, what is the mechanism that you have in place? Do you have, for instance, someone that is reporting to you on the different sustainability metrics or objectives of that specific team, or you have a dedicated team that's looking into these issues specifically? What is the status of that at NG?
So, as I said, we are a multinational organization. So in every country, there is one specific role that kind of oversees, advises, and supports the greater organizational stakeholders. And so as a functional role, we keep our role very small, only because we want to disseminate that information. We want to build that capacity with the right people. So as I mentioned, whether it is with procurement, whether it's with HR, whether it is with finance, or whether it is with operations, is building that necessary capacity without expanding and growing a one big functional entity. So this is the model that has been adopted with NG. And we find that it works well. It builds in that one NG culture, it builds in that capacity building, and at the same time, we all working to one common cause and mission. So my role is to really work with the different country points of contacts, whether it's through communications or whether it is through the different channels. How do I kind of get that information from this certain function? How do I work with this function to strengthen their kind of business processes and internal strategies to become more efficient and to become more vigilant in terms of how they implement certain processes?
And what would be the skill sets and experiences that a chief sustainability officer should have in their toolbox to perform their role?
So You know, as much as I would love to say and have a general statement to say that anybody can actually do sustainability, I found, and especially bringing myself into context here, having a strong health, safety, and environmental background is always a leap forward as you roll out sustainability, because a lot of the information relates to environmental sustainability, which is your carbon footprint, managing your natural resources. That is now obviously of urgency and of top priority globally. But then you also, you know, may not necessarily have the capabilities on the other social indicators. So this is where you would need to work with different stakeholders in the business and build that capacity. But if I really go out on the limb and saying having that health, safety, and environmental kind of portfolio in your background is really a instrumental leap in supporting the sustainability governance that an organization is already driving.
Yeah, we had talks with other chief sustainability officers and heads of sustainability in the region, and some of them came from very different backgrounds, actually.
Mm-hmm.
For example, you could find people that used to be in the head of finance or operations. Yes. Some of them came from marketing or communications. For those people with not necessarily an environmental background, what would you say they should be the core skills to perform that kind of of mandate as chief sustainability officer in the right way?
Look, you know, there's never a right answer, but ultimately, sometimes, as you've rightfully said, we have CFOs that are also double hatting into chief sustainability officers. We have, as you said, sustainability ranging into the communications and marketing kind of portfolios. There's never one set rule for every single organization. If that kind of machine and internal working model works well for an organization, that's great. But the best advice and the best message is that what we tend to see is that if you're holding a hat of communications, your focus tends to be more on the outer communication messaging and the image of an organization. If you're wearing a hat of a CFO, you're really looking and crunching those numbers when it comes to driving those efficiencies, which tends to kind of not really look at the other social indicators, or may not really necessarily look at natural preservations, even though maybe climate change and climate commitments when it comes to carbon footprint may be a top priority, but tends to really focus on key requirements. And so there's also discussions where sustainability should fall under risk management. So I think it all goes back to what's the priority for an organization? Are they starting off? Do they need to prioritize certain functions, certain areas that pushes the sustainability agenda? And that's fine. Those business models actually work. But in terms of a longevity, one should really look at who could be cross-functional. And this could be also a chief of staff, because they're well orientated in understanding the full strategy of a business. It could be chief of strategy, or it could be someone that's heading any of the business portfolio that have a well-rounded vision of the entire organization. So I think, you know, business models differ between different entities.
And finally, what are the short and medium term priorities for a chief sustainability officer, in your case at Engie, for the next few years?
So, you know, I will break the question down maybe in two parts. The first part, globally, we all know the urgency comes around, you know, managing and mitigating our climate impacts. And that goes right down to what is our carbon footprint, how much of that carbon footprint are we emitting as an organization? And I think that is globally the first trend of urgency that we all focused on. So if you're not on board on that, I think that is actually your first starting point. The second one is building resiliency. So if we're an organization that needs to report on our carbon footprint, what is our strategy to decarbonize? Secondly, how do we build resiliency in our portfolio as an organization? And I touch back a little bit on the COVID era, as I would say it. That taught us so many life lessons. But the biggest life lessons that I will bring it back into the conversation here is economies were stopped, supply chains were stopped. So if you did not have in an organization a resilient portfolio of your supply chain, resiliency built into your operations, I think that's the second priority, because we know that the climate impacts are going to affect us in the future, if not already as we speak. And for you to be a resilient organization, you need to recover. You need to have those plans of actions in place and kind of kicked off immediately if we're ever faced with any disaster or situations that stop us as an organization. The second part of that equation in terms of priorities is what we see in terms of trends these days is improving the social indicators around diversity and inclusion. And again, it goes back to where you are operating in the world. If you are in the GCC, we find traditionally that the diversity element when it comes to gender parity is maybe not at the right targets and at the right levels. So if you're an organization, and then I go back to NG per se, is that if one of our targets is to maintain a 50 by 50 gender parity in our operations and the way we do business. So that becomes for me a second priority. I would love to say it's the first and second, but they're all equally important. But so there's different priorities, I think, lie with different sectors and different organizations. But as we speak of today, climate mitigation, climate adaptation, top agenda points that we need to focus on. The other social aspects is obviously around diversity and inclusion, health and safety that becomes important in an organization as you roll out your business requirements. There's so many. I wish I could say it's all of them when it comes under the umbrella of environmental, social, and governance. And building initiatives and projects and reporting on it has to go part and parcel with having a strong process. And then that goes back to governance. So with NG and bringing NG into the conversation here, a priority, of course, is our net zero strategy by 2045 across all our scopes. Yes, we've built those robust systems and processes to maintain our trajectory to reach 2045. That's been, disseminated through awareness, through capacity building. We have that the entire engine of NG on board and working towards our net zero strategy. Another conversation that as we are talking about that becomes a priority for NG is adaptation. We know that if we do not meet a 1.5 degree target or a 2 degree target globally, what will happen to our operational assets impacted by climate change? And so we're trying to build in those resiliency plans so that we could soundproof our operational activities on the long term. Another conversation that is top on the agenda within NG is nature. It was always a priority, but is that how do we bring nature into and embed it into our business models? How do we roll out projects that, kind of have an equilibrium of ensuring nature is at the forefront? And as I mentioned, from a social perspective, D&I targets has always been a major priority with stringent kind of KPIs that we have to meet on a yearly basis. Health and safety is also a top priority at NG. And there's many other things. I could go right down to ethics. So they're all kind of sitting on the same surface line of priorities, but ultimately, our net zero strategy is the kind of first line of defense that we're working towards.
It seems 20 minutes go by pretty quickly in this kind of conversation, so we'll have to wrap it up here. But I'd like to thank our featured guest speaker for this week, Daxita Rajkumar, Chief Sustainability Officer for the Middle East, Africa, and Asia at NG. Feel free to follow her on social media for more insights on sustainability and the journey of NG, one of the companies at the forefront of the energy transition, and also follow Gulf Intelligence for more insights. Thank you, Daxita.
Thank you so much.